John F. Kennedy was young, charismatic, and full of promise. He represented a new generation of leadership. But behind the charm was a minefield of secrets. In the last episode, we discussed the rise of the shadow government, influences from the mob, and how they have become interwoven with each other. In this episode, we uncover how Cold War pressure, betrayal by the CIA, and old debts from organized crime brought JFK to the edge of confrontation with the deepest powers in America, and how his refusal to play along made him a target, not just for assassination, but for erasure. This is the turning point in history that shaped everything that followed. Let's begin.
Shh, no one's listening.
When JFK ran for president in 1960, the world was caught in a Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a geopolitical chess game. And, well, fear of communism justified almost anything. Coups, assassinations, black budgets, and secret wars. The CIA was starting to reach its peak, operating worldwide with little oversight. And behind JFK's polished campaign was a shadow few dared to discuss. His father, Joseph Kennedy, already deeply tied to mob families and business elites, was rumored to have struck deals with organized crime to help secure the presidency for his son. Allegedly, figures like Sam Giancana and Frank Sinatra helped influence union votes and city turnouts in key swing states like Illinois and West Virginia. Whether JFK knew about these dealings is still debated, but the debt existed, and those who helped JFK expected favors in return. When Kennedy won, it wasn't just America celebrating, it was the mob too. Meanwhile, the political landscape surrounding him was anything but clean. Lyndon B. Johnson, his running mate, had deep ties to Texas oil money and backdoor influence in the Senate. Many senior Congress members had either mob support or CEA alliances. In states like Illinois, Louisiana, and New York, entire voting blocks were controlled by local bosses who answered to organized crime. Political machines that shaped elections in places like Chicago were under the influence of figures tied to the outfit. Southern Democrats, especially those in Texas and Louisiana, also had informal agreements with covert operatives to secure re-election or suppress opposition. But even though they won, JFK and LBJ were never close. In fact, there was significant animosity between the two. Johnson had long-standing ambitions of his own, and well, many within his circle resented the Kennedy family's wealth, privilege, and rapid political ascent. Johnson viewed JFK as an elite outsider, young, inexperienced, and disconnected from the rough-and-tumble world of Washington deal-making that Johnson had mastered. So, why did Kennedy choose him as a running mate? The answer was political strategy. Johnson had influence over Southern Democrats and brought balance to the ticket, geographically and ideologically. Winning Texas was critical, and Kennedy needed Johnson's pull with Southern voters and congressional allies. Still, the resentment between the two men never faded. Johnson saw himself as the rightful heir to power, while Kennedy's inner circle, including his brother Bobby, considered Johnson crass, untrustworthy, and too entangled with corrupt business and political interests. It wasn't just personal. Johnson reportedly disliked the entire Kennedy family, especially Robert F. Kennedy, who openly mocked and challenged his authority. Behind the smiles at campaign stops, there was a deep and growing schism, one that would only widen after the election. And Kennedy was about to discover just how much he was not in control. In April 1961, the CIA launched an operation to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba. It was called the Bay of Pigs. The CIA had trained Cuban exiles, armed them, and promised Kennedy it would be a quick victory. But the entire plan hinged on one thing: United States military support, air cover. When Kennedy refused to escalate the mission and send in airstrikes, the invasion collapsed. The result? Well, it was a humiliating disaster. Cuban forces crushed the invaders. The world honestly mocked America, and inside the CIA, rage began to simmer. The first air raid, carried out by B-26 bombers flown by Cuban exiles, was meant to destroy the Cuban Air Force on the ground, but failed to eliminate all of Castro's operational planes. A second airstrike, scheduled to coincide with the main amphibious landing, was canceled by Kennedy in an effort to maintain plausible deniability of direct U.S. involvement and to minimize the visible American role in the operation. But why was Cuba so important to the CIA and to organized crime? Before the revolution, Cuba was a paradise for mob investments. Havana was a booming hub for gambling, prostitution, drugs, and money laundering, often in collaboration with corrupt Cuban officials under dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro's revolution ended all of it. He nationalized casinos, expelled mafia operators, and aligned with the Soviet Union. For both the CIA and the mob, Fidel Castro wasn't just a communist threat. He was bad for business. Mob bosses like Meyer Lansky and Santo Trafficante had lost millions. CIA leaders, obsessed with Cold War dominance, saw Castro's Cuba as a Soviet beachhead just 90 miles off U.S. shores. This is why Operation Zapata, what became the Bay of Pigs, was so heavily pushed. It wasn't just anti-communism, it was profit, power, and paying back favors. Everyone had something to gain: the government, the mob, and other political powers. The Bay of Pigs, crushing Fidel Castro or a possible full-on war, were in the interest of a lot of people. But there was a problem. Castro already knew they were coming. Cuban intelligence, with some help from Soviet advisors, had been watching suspicious activities for months. Exile training camps in Guatemala and Nicaragua, well, they were poorly kept secrets. Leaks were everywhere. Even the New York Times ran stories before the invasion. So when the invaders landed at Playa Girón, they were met with fierce resistance. Kennedy, realizing just how badly the CIA had underestimated Castro's readiness, called off the second wave of airstrikes. Strikes that, well, might have neutralized Cuban defenses. Why did JFK pull back? There were several reasons: international pressure, fear of Soviet retaliation, and a real desire to avoid overt United States military involvement in a covert operation. If JFK wouldn't have called off the second wave of airstrikes, there was a good chance of a retaliation from the Soviets that could have easily escalated into a full-on war right at the doorstep of the country. He had been sold a plan with what they called plausible deniability, but honestly, it was anything but. Had he approved that second airstrike, the United States would have been fully exposed as backing an illegal coup against a sovereign nation. That could have triggered a much larger war, possibly even nuclear escalation. But had Kennedy followed through, the invasion might have succeeded. Castro could have fallen, but the risks were too high. Instead, the invasion failed, and those who had pushed the plan, CIA officers, exiled Cubans, and organized crime backers, blamed Kennedy. JFK took public responsibility, but behind closed doors, he was furious. He felt betrayed, misled by intelligence operatives who had expected him to commit fully to war. In response, Kennedy fired CIA Director Allen Dulles, the most powerful man in the agency and an architect of many covert operations. Dulles had deep ties to the Council on Foreign Relations, oil interests in Texas, former Nazi scientists from Operation Paperclip, and, possibly, organized crime. Ironically, Dulles would later be appointed to the Warren Commission, the very body tasked with investigating JFK's murder. Coincidence? Or cleanup? This sparked more than just controversy. It gave birth to conspiracies that Kennedy's death wasn't just an assassination by a lone gunman, but an inside job. They claimed that there was only one shooter, despite testimony that there were shots from the grassy knoll, and that it was a magic bullet that went through two men, changing direction midair. The Warren Commission did everything but make the American people feel like they were being told the truth. The Bay of Pigs was more than a failure. It was a turning point. It was the start of a quiet civil war between the president and the intelligence agency. So why did the CIA care so much about Cuba? Why were they so eager to remove Castro? Well, the answer lies in casinos and billions of dollars. Before Castro's revolution, Cuba was a playground for the American mob. Meyer Lansky, for example, had casinos all across Havana. And Trafficante, that Florida mob boss, he controlled gambling and drugs throughout the Caribbean. The island was run with the blessing of the corrupt dictator Batista, and it made the mob richer than Vegas ever could. But when Castro came to power, he shut it all down. He nationalized American businesses, burned mob-owned properties. The mob wanted revenge, plain and simple. Honestly, it was a win-win for the CIA. On one hand, they could get rid of Castro and continue with under-the-table dealings with casinos. And on the other, the country would go to war, and they would make money through what was starting to become what we now know today as the military-industrial complex. So they teamed up. The CIA used the mob for wet work, assassinations, and sabotage. And now, with JFK blocking their plans, the alliance turned against him. JFK appointed his brother Robert F. Kennedy as Attorney General, and RFK wasn't interested in playing nice. He launched the most aggressive campaign against organized crime in United States history. He went after Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters, major mafia families in New York and Chicago, labor racketeering and political corruption. To the mob, this was treason. They had helped JFK. Now his brother was throwing them in prison. RFK had over 600 mob prosecutions underway by 1963. And, well, he wasn't stopping. What had once been a handshake behind the curtain was now a knife fight in the open. The Kennedy brothers were burning every bridge the mob had built, and making enemies inside the CIA, the Pentagon, and corporate America in the process. Then came the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. In October of 1962, U.S. intelligence discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. The world held its breath. War seemed imminent. But JFK didn't launch an invasion. He didn't bomb Havana. Instead, he opened a secret diplomatic channel with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The public saw a strong United States military posture, blockades and warnings. But behind the scenes, JFK and Khrushchev cut a private deal. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States would secretly remove its missiles from Turkey. Peace was achieved. But, well, it wasn't celebrated. The military-industrial complex was livid. They expected escalation. They wanted war. They needed war. Defense contractors, CIA hawks, and even high-ranking generals saw JFK's diplomacy as weakness. JFK had just proven the world could avoid war through negotiation, and in doing so, he threatened trillions in defense contracts and covert budgets. By late 1963, JFK had fired CIA leadership, blocked mob revenge in Cuba, undermined the arms race, ended the arms deal with Israel, and empowered his brother to dismantle organized crime. He was no longer just a president. He was a threat to the system was built before him. And in the next episode, we follow the trail of evidence that points to a conspiracy decades in the making, where government agencies, crime families, and political interests all converged in one event. November 22nd, 1963. The day America changed forever. Remember, follow the trail and question everything.
No one's listening. Like and subscribe.